Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tommaso Maule, and today I'm going to be presenting over my honors thesis, which is analyzing the economic discourse and policy realities of right-wing populism in Latin America and Europe. So today we live in a world where populism is kind of a buzzword. We see it in every headline. Right-wing populist leader wins election in Japan. Right-wing populist party gains momentum in Chile. It's everywhere nowadays. So I kind of wanted to explore the literature gap that we have, where they focus too much on the socio-cultural and institutional contexts of right-wing populism. A lot of it is focused on nativist, nationalist, anti-immigration, religious fundamentalist ideologies, and the fear of democratic erosion and executive consolidation, right? So I kind of wanted to look at the economic side of it because it tends to be overlooked. And when it is looked at, it tends to be seen as a uniformity. They all think that's on the traditional right to left spectrum. But the real world kind of differs quite a bit, and that's what my thesis kind of I sought to look at. So my two research questions that kind of guided my paper was, is there variation in economic message among right-wing populists? And then the second question is, how aligned or how much of their policy reflects the messaging that they kind of had in the campaign trail. And here we can see Maule with the chainsaw, which is why I titled it Chainsaws, Privatizations, and Tariffs, and then Bolsonaro with his little guns. So how I analyzed this, I kind of looked at 4 contemporary cases across 2 different contexts, 2 different regional and institutional contexts. I looked at Javier Milei in Argentina, who's the current president of Argentina. I looked at Jair Bolsonaro, former president of Brazil. I looked at Viktor Orban, current Prime Minister of Hungary, and I looked at Giorgia Meloni, current Prime Minister of Italy. So I wanted to look at their economic rhetoric during the campaign, before the campaign, right after the campaign, and some of their policy outcomes. So did their policies align with their rhetoric? And I didn't want to look at economics broadly. I chose 4 specific economic dimensions: welfare, the welfare state, trade and market orientation, fiscal policy, so taxation, debt management, public spending, and then institutional restructuring. So are they going to reform the central bank? Do they want to reform regulations and all that jazz? So the big pattern in messaging that I found was that there's 2 distinct kind of schools, and you can graph it regionally or you can see it regionally. Latin America, their messaging is responding to left-wing failures. So in Brazil, we have the PT, the Workers' Party. They had a huge corruption scandal, a bunch of financial mismanagement, the economy was bloated, and Bolsonaro kind of came and sealed that vacuum and garnered support through the failures and the mismanagement of the left-wing government. In Argentina, Milei is kind of fighting against the Peronist his Peronist predecessors who financially mismanaged Argentina. Now they're kind of in financial ruin, so his messaging is fighting against that. And then in Europe, it's completely different. It's around the EU and the perceived overreach of the European Union, and it's also over the migrant crisis of the 2010s. A lot of people were kind of scared. They were anxious about a great replacement, and Meloni brings that up a lot. So a lot of their economic policy economic messaging is focused around that. So let's kind of go through each one. Welfare is conditional in Latin America, so they want it to be work-based, employment-based, instead of giving it out just willy-nilly. Bolsonaro thinks that the former president used welfare as a clientelistic tool to garner support, so now he wants to change that. He's saying, look, it needs to be employment-based. Milei also finds that welfare is a waste of public spending, so he is kind of fighting against the excessive spending of the Peronist predecessors and using conditionality as a tool, as a message. And then welfare in Europe is kind of over nativist grounds. So it's for Italians first. Hungary for Hungarians. They are excluding the migrant populations, the people who really need it, and creating that divide, the corrupt elite versus the pure people. Restructuring also in Latin America is based on the left-wing state. They're trying to fix the inefficiencies of the left-wing state. They're trying to fix the corruption scandals, the PT corruption scandals. They're trying to fix financial mismanagement, so they restructure inside the state. The European cases are a little bit different because they're kind of challenging the supranational EU. the EU, they see a perceived overreach of EU regulation and policy, so they are kind of trying to restructure that. They're fighting against that. Fiscal policy in Europe, it's kind of strategic anti-austerity, but it's anti-austerity against the European Union. So they do not want the policy, they don't want overreaching austerity policies like spending caps and taxation caps. And in Latin America, it's kind of shock therapy. They're fixing what the left messed up. They're fixing the debt crisis in Argentina. They're fixing the bloated economy in Brazil. That was what their messaging kind of centered around. And then trade in Latin America is super neoliberalism. This kind of follows a trend from 1990s, 1970s with Pinochet. It started with Pinochet, and neoliberalism has kind of been a trend that has evolved now into Bolsonaro and Maule, who's an anarcho-capitalist, super neoliberal. And then in the EU, again, they're fighting against supranational organizations. So it's conditional protectionism. They're using, Orban is using interventionism to really stop foreign entities from coming in, and Italy is using protectionism to trade on Italy's own terms. They don't want to work in the globalized economy. They want to do their own thing. So those are the two big patterns I found in economic messaging. And we have to look at policy alignment. So there's a shared reality where they all have to work. They're not in a vacuum. There's a political machine. There's a bunch of institutions. There's checks and balances, and they all have to work in that, either in a parliamentary system like Orban and Meloni, or a presidential system like Bolsonaro and Milei. So Orban has a pretty strong alignment with his economic messages, and this is because when he won his election in 2010, he had a super majority. So he had 2/3 majority in the parliament, and he was able to restructure a bunch of things. He was able to cut checks and balances pretty significantly. So he has essentially consolidated power, right? But he is still pragmatically using his power because as a radical Eurosceptic, he has moderated that because he uses EU funds. He needs EU funds for his oligarchic community, to siphon off funds, but also for general welfare state, public spending, and all that stuff. So there is a pragmatism to it, but there is still strong alignment in between messaging and policy. Meloni also has strong coalition stability. In Italy, coalitions are very short-lived and weak usually, so it's kind of rare that Meloni has been able to stabilize the coalition and continue to pass policy. She's been super pragmatic with it as another raging Eurosceptic. She's kind of moderated her tone, and now she's kind of an EU sweetheart trying to work with the US and the EU to work with trade since Trump is so anti-trade. But yeah, again, it's pragmatic, but it is still pretty aligned with her messaging. And then Bolsonaro, who's president of Brazil, former president of Brazil, had limited alignment. Brazil has a super fragmented party system. I think there's like 23 parties in Congress. And he failed to work within and maneuver within the party politics that is at play in Brazil. So in Brazil, there's politics as usual, and he failed to work within that. So he did not pass any policies. And near the end of his presidency, when impeachment was kind of looming on top of him and re-election was coming up, he was like, oh, I gotta start maneuvering a little bit. So he partnered with the big center and passed a bunch of pragmatic policies to try to gain support. And I think it's super limited alignment. He really did not do a whole bunch of what he said he was gonna do, and when he did do it, it was super diluted. Milei, I think, has some more mixed alignment. He came in with not a working majority. He could not do a whole bunch, so he's utilized short-term alliances and executive decrees, DNUs, to kind of pass policies. But he's mainly constrained by Congress, so a lot of these policies that he tries to pass are diluted, delayed, or ultimately blocked. But at the end of the day, I think there's still a mixed alignment there because he has been able to pass a lot of his shock therapy policies. He's cut inflation pretty significantly. Now it's kind of going back up, but he's done a lot of good stuff, or not good stuff, but he's done a lot of stuff that he said he was going to do, right? He's cut a lot of ministries, a lot of bureaucracy, so he has done what he said he was going to do. So, in conclusion, there's kind of a twofold contribution I have found, or I've found from my answers. The first one is that right-wing populist economic messaging can kind of be divided regionally. In Europe, they're fighting against, or they're answering to the EU supranational overreach and the migrant crisis. And then in Latin America, they're kind of combating the left-wing failures of predecessing governments. And it's kind of, yeah, so it's based on historical and political context. And then the second part to my answer is that the policy alignment is explained by institutional context. So you hear a lot of stuff like Trump is going to do this, Trump is going to do that, or Milei is going to do this, Milei is going to do that. You have to, at the end of the day, I kind of realized that you have to look at the institutions that they are within, because that is how policies are passed, and that is how the alignment of policies work. So they can say all this grandiose, bombastic things, but at the end of the day, institutions is what matters. And that was all I had for y'all today. Thank you for listening, and I'm open for questions.
I think your research is so interesting. And I'm from Chile. There's a current election coming up, and it's gonna be, I think, pretty similar. Like the government, he's Republican, probably pretty similar to Bolsonaro. And I don't think he's gonna be able to have a majority in the Congress. But also, I wanted to point out that yeah, Latin America is more focused on trying to get rid of the left, what they did with the economy, stuff like that. But there's something interesting I want you to get your opinion in Chile, that they're also trying to combat immigration, the issues that Europe is having also, is happening in Chile, but also combating the left failed economic policies. So I wanted to get, what do you see the future of Latin America as a union?
I think Latin America still has much less pulling power than Europe for migrants, right? Europe, African and pan-Arab countries can just cross the Mediterranean Sea and they're in Europe, they're in Southern Europe. In Brazil, they have to cross the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean to come from China. So I don't think right-wing populism is not ever going to answer, but they won't in the near future ever have to manipulate their messaging to attack the immigration crisis like they do in Europe.
So in Chile, for example, is a big population of Venezuelans.
Oh, true. There is a Venezuelan part of it. Bolsonaro also kind of had this distaste for Venezuelans and the migration of Venezuelans into Brazil, but that was never at the core part of their economic messaging. I feel like it was always, or from what I saw from Bolsonaro and Milei, it was always against the left-wing governments from before.
But Chile.
Oh, okay. Hi, that was a really good presentation. It's improved so much since the last time I saw it at the Honors Thesis prep. What I want to say is I saw some similarities in regards to some of the words you were using, like conditionality, pragmatism, which it's really interesting, and I just as a comment primarily, that the language that you're using, it's in resounding, comes from actually the Chinese. A lot of the language that they are bringing in to some of the states that they're trying to get involved, like in Latin America with El Salvador and some other countries like in Panama and in Greece and so on, they use words like pragmatic engagement and bilateral agreements,
Sure.
as well as human conditionality. My question with all of this is, do you think that we might see a decrease in human rights? Because it's part of their rhetoric as well. I didn't see it as much in this, but I do want to just ask you, do you think that given the similarities, we might go towards less human rights in the future?
Sure. Are you talking about Latin America specifically?
Whichever you're more comfortable with.
So in Europe, there's already kind of that fear of that woke culture, and there's a lot like Orban has kind of tried to silence a lot of the LGBTQ parades and stuff like that. So I don't know if that's what you mean by human rights, but there's definitely like a silencing of sociocultural wokeism, right? And in Latin America, I'm not saying that there's no sociocultural aspects to it, because Bolsonaro, again, didn't like when Venezuelans came into Brazil. He didn't like indigenous peoples. He thought they were kind of taking up space for neo-extractivism so they could cut down on the lumber and stuff. So I'm not saying there's not any of that right now. There definitely is, and there's definitely still gonna, I think, grow.
So
I guess as time goes
that is
on,
my
yeah.
question is, the question was that, would it continue to deteriorate, for instance, like human rights? Would we see more concerns in regards to that? And why I also brought it up is because I saw one of my presidents, Bukele from El Salvador, and we're currently going through a human rights crisis with how he's been engaging with the country and some of its concerns. So you do see it as potentially a concern for the future.
Sure, I think El Salvador is an interesting case because the insane amount of gang violence there was there, and it's also a much smaller country than Brazil and Argentina. So I think it's kind of maybe hard to predict. I don't have a clear answer for that.
Just a quick comment. By the way, I'm the mentor, so I know. I think the questions so far are bringing attention to why it is important, because people are asking questions, and again, it's not a criticism about some of the sociological aspects of populism. You're saying that we need to look at the economic message, and those vary from case to case, right? So, for example, if you don't talk about El Salvador, we can talk about their social, economic, anti-immigrant, anti-woke, anti-this, anti-that. But what is his economic message, right? It's about cryptocurrencies, and those things matter, right? And to try to understand how these right-wing populists actually approach economics is something that people don't focus on much, right?
Yeah.
Just like that here. But it's interesting because at the end of the day, one could argue that a lot of the social, cultural rhetoric is smokescreen to hide an economic agenda that really, really matters. So that was just a quote.
Can I get a comment? So we're going to argue. So I wonder though if populism, and you're right, I agree with what you're saying, but I think the appeal is maybe more of a cultural one, because that, for example, Trumpism in terms of economics is all over the place. So there's some statism there, there's some, billionaire tax cuts, there's all sorts of stuff. Latin American stuff, compared to Hungary, different things there, and I just wonder whether the core of all this is one, a cultural one in terms of appeal, but also that personalistic politics of the great leader kind of thing.
I mean, yeah, it's there. But they're going to do different things economically, right?
Right.
Was that a question for me?
Yeah.
All right, well, like I said, the cultural part of it is a lot more focused in the United States and Europe, a lot because of the migrant crisis, or immigration in general, illegal immigration here, migrant crisis in Europe. Latin America doesn't have a ton of the immigration problems that are at the heart of populism in Europe and the United States. So I think the economic part of it in Latin America is a lot more beneficial to look at, not beneficial, but beneficial to look at than the sociocultural aspects that you would see here in Europe.
We have time for one more question. If anybody has one? All right, great job, Tommaso. Yeah, go the first slide. I got Dr. Rodrigo Nunez.
This is the awkward
Oh,
part.
Lord.
I met Tommaso a couple years ago, right, at Latin American Politics. And coming from the business school, and I'm always suspicious of those people. But it became clear very quickly to me that he was somebody who was very thoughtful and had interesting questions and different things to say. And when he approached me to work on this project, I said yes. We're both Brazilian, by the way, so there's a connection there. And as far as process of mentoring somebody, this was one of the breeziest for me. He did an immense amount of research and work on collecting messages and speeches and understanding what these leaders were saying. And also just in terms of really asking questions about what is it that we are not reading in the literature, right? Everybody talks about populists and their approach to immigration and then LGBTQ communities and all that stuff, and now that's important, of course. But what are they saying economically, and what are they doing economically? Because those things at the end of the day matter a lot, right? And I was like, you're right, I always talk about right-wing populists and immigration and what have you, but what about the economics? So it was very interesting for me. And I was always very impressed, the stuff he was sending to me. He listens to feedback and takes it very well. There is only one big problem with Tommaso. That's a very serious one. He would always show up with wearing these horrendous jerseys from this terrible soccer team that I really dislike. And I think he did it on purpose. Congratulations, Greg.